Welcome to the All Out Coach podcast, where we cross borders between industries, countries, sportsmanship, and scientific thinking to reveal timeless values that anticipate and drive our legacy as we create leaders and learners across the worlds of business and healthcare. I'm your host, Tim Mikhelishvili. 4 years ago, during a turning point in my life, when I was working at a startup company, I somehow found myself in both one of the most difficult and most exciting moments of my career at the same time, leading a culture and values initiative for the medical division of my organization, yet finding that I had no opportunities to develop personally and professionally. And so, in search of some inspiration, throughout the adrenaline-filled roller coaster focused on the product launch, I signed up for an MIT Leading Organizations and Change course taught by Melissa Norcross, my guest today. And her passion for not only leadership and business, but teaching was exactly what I was searching at the time. And it played an instrumental role in accelerating my own journey towards leadership and learning. Melissa Norcross is an accomplished senior executive and consultant with more than 30 years of success on 3 continents across the financial, technology, and management consulting sectors. Throughout her career, she has held leadership positions at organizations including USAA, Collaborative Gain, and McKinsey & Company as well. As a former chief strategy officer and veteran operations and strategic consultant for firms including McKinsey & Company, her work spans across different industries. She has led operations and helped organizations improve their performance, their engagement, their sustainability, cut costs. Companies like USAA, as an executive director of strategy and planning, where she led the talent and culture strategy at USAA of a greater than $600 million division with a staff of over 2,200 employees. She helped Fortune 100 companies across pharma, tech, and financial companies to build and architect their portfolios, identify high potential products as well. And she continues to teach and share her expertise with her chief executive C-level peers in the Collaborative Gain network, where she counsels top executives and helps them improve their operational performance. She continues to research and teach on team performance, organizational change, and humility. Melissa holds BS in engineering from MIT, an MBA from Harvard Business School, and a PhD in values-driven leadership from Benedictine University's Center for Values-Driven Leadership. And today I'm very excited and honored to have Melissa tell us about the ultimate reasons and outcomes of inspiring and measuring team performance and how teams collaborate and compete as well. Melissa, what an honor to have you on the All Out Coach show. Thank you for being here, for accepting my invitation. I really look forward to our conversation.
I do as well. And I'm thrilled to be a part of this journey. I think one of the things that Tim knows about me is that I am super passionate about not only continually improving myself, but making sure I'm constantly reaching out to others around me so that we collectively get better together, whether I'm working with you or working next to you in a parallel organization. So I'm thrilled to be here.
Yes. I know that you have also your own consulting firm called Optimus.
Yep.
Correct?
I work with 2 different consulting firms, Optimus on the tech side of things, on cyber side, and Ad Lucem Group. Both of them I am pleased to have helped found, and they are both committed to organizational performance and improving what we're doing as leaders and as teams.
You know, thinking back to that course that I signed up for, and the Leading Organizations and Change, I remember that I didn't want the course to end. I was sad when it concluded, and I wanted to create that bridge with a lot of the other executives who had taken that course. And so I when I think about that course, I also think of it as a team, a learning team. So I'd like to begin by asking you, what makes those most innovative and memorable teams stand out to you today as you look back at your career?
Yeah, I think I have the same experience that probably everybody else has. At some point in our lives, in our career, we're part of something really special, something extraordinary, a team, and it's always some kind of team experience where you both individually and collectively performed in an extraordinary way. You did more than you thought possible, and you came together in a way that was surprising. And it almost felt like the team itself acts as a force multiplier. When I think about these kinds of teams, I think Miracle on Ice, Navy SEALs teams, sports teams that were individually, you do the math, and it looks as if they might be okay. But when you see them together in action, when you are a part of that, you all of a sudden realize there's so much more here than I anticipated. And they have a few things that are special about them. And one of my teams personally that I have is I was always a part of a rowing team. And there's a term they call swing. It's that sense that the boat itself begins to move in a magical way that you create when you are in perfect harmony. And I think we've all been there in that one moment where you just feel when you're rowing in a boat, you just feel light. The work feels easy. The progress feels more than you imagine. The plays run well. And this is true, on the technical side as well. We have those moments when the innovations and the breakthroughs just happen in such a regular way, and we feel like we can get ahead of schedule. We can perform more and deliver more than we thought possible. And I think the secret sauce to those are you have brought together groups of highly capable individuals, but you've done it in a way that they're focused on a superordinate goal. First and foremost, it's about how the team is doing, what the game score is, not what your individual performance is. And so everyone prioritizes that superordinate goal. But I think they also express a kind of humility. And that's what we see in there. And it's kind of at three levels. And I don't mean humility in the way that some people think about it, which is making less of yourself. It's about being self-aware, knowing your own capabilities, but also the limits of them. Warren Buffett at Berkshire Hathaway would say, know your circle of competence well. And these people who are humble and express that humility really, truly understand where are they competent. Where might they be individually extraordinary, but where are the limits of that? And they're careful not to play outside of that, and they understand those limits. So they know themselves, their strengths and their weaknesses, but they also possess this fierce resolve. They are all in. The old joke about the chicken and the pig, the chicken is participating in breakfast, but the pig is all in. And these people are all in. They have that fierce resolve to deliver. And lastly, they're willing to really look at their own performance with a kind of honesty. They admit the mistakes that they make, they learn from those, and they're able to see them quickly so that they can incorporate them into their next level of performance. If you think about a golfer who is able to reinvent themselves, a scientist who's able to quickly say, I was going down this path in a wrong way, an engineer who needs to discard a component of a design and move forward quickly, to be able to separate yourself from that disappointment as you see that failure really makes a difference in your ability to get to the next level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As we talk about some of the specifics of how teams compete and collaborate, I thought we'd start with some conflict first. An intriguing kind of topic to begin with: conflict resolution. As we go from how agreeable or disagreeable individuals are to then the dynamics that we build, the operations, the tools we create, right, and then the metrics and the outcomes. So in that kind of format, I want to ask you, what really makes some of those most innovative teams from a team dynamics perspective? Is it that they're most agreeable? Is it that they're disagreeable with each other, or that they're just simply most talented?
Yeah. In some ways, it's none of the above, right? For me, those best teams are the most committed to getting better. And because that's their superordinate goal, the conflict, or the fact when they rub against one another, is really in service of a greater good, of improving performance, of moving things forward. And they are willing to create this condition of what Amy Edmondson would call psychological safety. Mm-hmm. They make it safe to highlight mistakes. And she first sort of discovered this and focused on this when she was working with teams that were medical teams in hospitals and scientific teams, where there's a certain hierarchy, right? There's the star player, or the doctor, or the chief engineer. And instead, they eschewed the normal hierarchy and instead came to it as individuals, and each valued the other's perspective, and they were able to both create friction by offering different opinions, but there was a collective value on their different opinions. And so when the nurse spoke up and said, "Doctor, I disagree with that. This is what I observe," he could respect her point of view and see it from that point of view. And so it's less about agreement and disagreement, and more about diversity of perspective, and having the chutzpah, really, to value someone else's perspective and try and understand what's behind it when it disagrees with yours. And so there has to be that disagreement on content, but there has to be an agreement about how we show up together to pull that data in, and a value we place on each and every person's opinion and capability and expertise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's an important distinction you make between the actual outcome or the process of the disagreement to the value of it, how we perceive and how we respect each other's opinions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So from an operational standpoint, looking at conflict, for example, right, or dynamics, diversity, and inclusion, how do we create the intersections between departments or norms of communication to make sure that we have that psychological safety?
And I think this first and most important way is this overarching goal. And if I go back to like a Navy SEAL team or a sports team, it's really easy to see. But and that is that they have a common goal, a common enemy, a common competitor. And that is the most important thing. And what we're trying to do is make sure that is the focus. And rather than the individual thinking about how do I measure my own performance, what you're thinking about is that overarching goal. And that's true of departments. And so when I think about this, what I'm going to show this thing is the fact that when we're all aligned and at an individual level, when we're focused on the organizational goal and we're all connected, we're all on the same team. And so it matters then less about competing with a department or another place, and instead how you see through your personal position, your team, your department or group, through to the organization's objective, and keep that in mind. I think the other thing is that we have to really focus on coming at it with curiosity instead of competition, and innovation instead of selection. So the best ideas are not the ones that come from the finance department or the engineering department or the testing department or the QA department. They're the solutions and innovations that we create by coming together and bringing all of those points of view and capabilities together to create something even better. And the difference I've seen between stars and organizations that simply do well but not extraordinary is that understanding of how to come together to innovate and keep prioritizing what they're doing together over competing with one another.
It's great, I think, points about curiosity, not competition, and I'm sure you've played a strong, an important role in creating that type of environment in the teams that you led and you were part of. Speaking about the team dynamics a little bit more, and how you manage individuals, you mentioned organizations and individuals. Individuals have different types of backgrounds and universes that they bring to a team, and then motivations as well as personalities. When you have an ambitious, for example, and highly accomplished team player who's a new hire, and in the prime of his or her career, who's asking for that ball, and ownership of a project or mentorship, while providing candid feedback as well, and new solutions, new ideas, despite lack of resources or any mechanisms for professional development. How do you inspire such an employee in continuing to contribute with quality and continue to stay engaged? It's somewhat of a challenge, right? What are some of your suggestions?
It is, especially when you have, he's or she is a member of a wider team as well. And I view it very much as if, I go back to sort of Moneyball, and I think about what the capabilities that each of those team players brings. And I want to value that, take advantage of that, and also make sure that the first thing I do is maintain that psychological safety for my team. And the first thing I want to do is make sure that there is one and only one set of rules that I apply to everyone. That doesn't mean everybody plays the same position, has the same amount of playing time, but, scores the same number of goals, leads in the same way. But I want to make sure that there's a sense of fairness that is maintained across the rest of the team. Once I've got that, then I want to think about how I toggle between maximizing individual performance and maximizing team performance, and what capabilities that individual needs. When I think about bringing in a new person, I often think back to myself as I was starting my career and what I needed. And there were so many things that I wasn't incompetent. I knew certain things, but there were so many things I didn't know. And so one of the things I try and do is truly sit down with each of these individuals and have honest discussions about what they're good at, what they're capable of, but also what gaps they need to fill in. And I try and start that with where they want to go and what they want to be long term. Because if you're just looking to excel in one role, or maybe by delivering a certain breakthrough or a certain functional area, that's one thing. But if you're looking to be a general manager, you need a full set of skills and the ability to understand how things work at a much different way. You need mentors who have been around the system a lot longer. And so I start to think about, how do I round out the full portfolio of capabilities that they need? So I assign them hard tasks, but I try and assign them to those challenging tasks and those responsibilities in parallel with other people who have a different perspective on that, who can coach them through the things they don't know yet, so that you end up with two things at the end. You end up not only with that individual having delivered on this, but you end up with a team, not just that individual, but other people who now have additional skills that they didn't have when this project or initiative started. And that's how I think about it. Sometimes it can be easy to fall into this trap that, you're getting stars and you want to sort of cater to the stars and make special rules for them.
Yeah.
And that can be where your team starts to break down, because you start to rob the star of the ability to have others around them who improve their capabilities. You break down the culture of psychological safety that you have. You also are then dependent on a single point of failure. And that's never good either. But more importantly than that, the first thing I think of is, am I doing this person a long-term disservice by how I'm assigning them? Or am I structuring the work so that longer term, they will become the people I want to work for and who do extraordinary things?
Yeah. I created a continuum, trying to visualize this dilemma of aspiration to ability to responsibility, because my hypothesis is that when there is a difference between, and that difference is significant enough between abilities and responsibilities, that's when you have lower quality, a decrease in quality of engagement and performance. And and I think those individual conversations, those honest conversations that you just talked about, are a great start, where to really discovering how you can match them as well as possible, to express the full potential of each individual, and maximize individual performance in order to do the same for the team. And I heard also Adam Grant talk about this interesting point of optimal distinctiveness, is what he calls it, where he believes that every employee needs to feel like they're distinct enough, that they have that unique personality, that they contribute to a team that they also belong to, at the same time as the organizational's goal is for them to contribute to a team. But so where is that balance between being that individual, being that unique individual, and a contributor to a team, is often challenging, particularly when there's lack of resources, I think, right, to develop people professionally. And did you find yourself creating resources when even when they were scarce, for example, in more, let's say, startup, smaller organizations? Do you find that it's the resources or the time is the reason, maybe, for a challenge for developing individuals?
So I think too often we look at a problem and we see the constraints and not the possibilities. And what happens is, people can look at something and say, well, there's only one project, either this person leads it or I lead it, and it's a lose-lose. And, either I get the project and the organization loses this person, or or their contributions, or vice versa. And I think that's a false dichotomy. And I think it presupposes that we as leaders can't innovate, that we as teams won't innovate. And instead, I try and look for what's the solution, what's the innovative solution in which it's a yes and. We all get what we need. We have these individuals who are amazing And yet there's time for others to contribute, and there's things we get out of it. I think if I think back to, playing hockey with somebody like Wayne Gretzky, I mean, there is this sense that, well, I lose because I don't maybe score as many goals or whatever. But if you unpack that, what you realize is that you get the opportunity to grow in unique ways. And Gretzky, just like many of your best team leaders and individual contributors, will find ways to coach and mentor others through it. So what happens is, by the time you get to the end of that project, everybody has gotten a chance to lead. Everyone has gotten a chance to develop fundamentally new skills. And if we think about budget constraints, it's usually not the money. It's usually not the number of projects. It's usually, and sometimes we'll say, well, there's not enough time. But in actual fact, there's plenty of time.
Yeah.
If you take the perspective that it's possible to do multiple things at the same time, I can lead this in such a way that I have certain expectations that multiple people will do simultaneously, that we will develop new skills, that each person, so I try and manage it at both levels. What am I looking for the growth opportunity on this initiative project against this objective for each individual, so that they can continue on their growth path? And what am I looking for collectively, so that everybody has this great experience? And you should be able to set up sort of this continuous cycle of learning where by the time you finish with a project, every single person has had the ability to do something that grows them, as well as the collective performance. And if you're not doing that, I would argue you need to rethink your role as a leader, because that's what good mentors, good coaches, good leaders do. Yep. They're constantly looking for that.
Yeah. How does onboarding and training predict long-term engagement?
I think in some ways, onboarding is like a first impression. It's like your first chance at shaping some things. And what you're able to do with onboarding is set a level playing field and set some expectations, right? When you walk into that class, or that team or that environment, you are the new person on the block. And I think the way you need to set that, the most important thing is in onboarding is not, frankly, it's not to train people in how we do things, what we do, what we, give them skills. It's about teaching them and onboarding them into your culture, so that what you're doing is demonstrating what acceptable behavior is, that we support one another, that we create a safe environment, that we strive for excellence, that we work together and collaborate to do those things, and that we learn together, and you create that tone of constant learning and building for one another. Then you start the content onboarding. And that would be the only thing. If you don't do that up front, you pay for it later, right? If you allow, and I've worked with them too, if you allow the rock star scientist to walk into the team and believe and act in a way that is not collaborative, that doesn't demonstrate his presence or her presence as a peer, as a fellow player, that he instead is like that first young doctor who walks in the room and says, I'm the doctor, I'll be in charge, and shuts every other person down. If you let that happen, you have not only broken your team, but you have set that person up for failure. If instead you focus on that culture, then there's content next. It's hard to undo that first level setting if you get it wrong. If you forget if you don't cover as well the content of the company and what they're focused on and the scientific depth of this breakthrough or that breakthrough, that you can fix easily. The other is a little harder to fix.
Yeah. So we spoke about conflict as well as team dynamics. Now I want to switch gears a little bit to talk more about operations. And I know you've worked in so many diverse environments.
Yeah.
You've helped a major Polish bank institution dramatic profit and growth. While you're at McKinsey and Company, you designed HR restructuring strategy there. You've worked at USAA, where you developed different KPIs, dashboards, and accelerated goal achievement as well. So what were some of those techniques in the different environments that you used? Can you share, maybe give us a glimpse of some of them?
Yeah, I mean, each situation is very different. And it is unique, but some of the themes and some of the checklists that I go down mentally are the same.
Okay.
The first thing I look to do is unpack, how are we making decisions? Are they smart? Are they data-based? Are we using data in order to make sure we're making the best decisions possible? I was working years ago at a pharmaceutical company, and the biggest thing we unpacked is that it was really tough to tell which scientific projects to sort of put our money on. And that was a decision-making process that wasn't yet mature. And so we put a lot of effort into maximizing that. When I was at a software company, the data and analytics we were using to understand profitability of product lines and other things wasn't as strong and as well communicated and easy to digest as it should have been. So those are sort of two examples of where you need to think about, are you getting the right data to the right people to make smart decisions? And that's usually it's usually the data connecting to the decisions that's the problem. It's not that people want to make bad decisions. Nobody ever wants to do that. You make the best decision with what you have in front of you. And so often the challenge is making sure they get the right things in front of them. Now, the second thing I look at is sort of being laser focused on doing what matters most. Less is more. If I try and do 12 things at the same time, chances are I'm going to do 11 and a half of them really badly. If instead I focus on one or two things, or no more than a handful, and my rule of thumb is if it's more than I can remember on my hand and count down, it's too many. Because your switching costs take over, you're not able to focus, and that's true at organizational levels as well. So the thing I love about Agile is it flips the script. Instead of trying to do 12 things at once, you do one or two things at a time. And then when those are done, you do the next one or two things. And that's sort of my second principle. My third one is that I want to put in place clear success metrics with early warning signals for when they're going off track. So if profitability and employee engagement or customer satisfaction is let's say profitability and customer satisfaction are my lagging indicators. Those are what I'm trying to maximize. I want some leading indicators in place to understand when things could be starting to go off track. Is the market starting to slow down? Are small things? Are my employees dissatisfied? What's going on there? Because those are usually early indicators that something's not quite right. So I try and get the KPIs and the OKRs in place. Again, trying to stick really hard to my rule that it should fit on a hand. I shouldn't have to take my shoes off to count how many things I'm measuring. And then lastly, transparency and radical honesty about what matters most. And it's not and I think we can often get wrapped around the axle trying to make too many things count. But the simplicity for me of sports and sports analogies is that
Sure.
you always know who won or lost the game, and you know why. And even in sports, while you measure the score, you also look at sportsmanship and how they showed up. And those two things are the same metrics I use for every business I'm looking at. What does success look like? What does winning in the market look like? And how do I make sure I'm doing it as a good sport, with character, with integrity?
Mm-hmm.
And we all have that moral compass that tells us what's it like to be extraordinary in those dimensions. And so doing both of those at the same time is the other thing that I try and make sure everyone understands how they will be measured individually. And I go back to sort of those overlapping circles individually, at the team level, at the department level, and at the organizational level.
Yep.
We should know what winning looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a few points that you brought up that I want to just address also. The database decision making. I think nowadays we're blessed with how much data we have, right?
We might be cursed by how much data.
Blessed and cursed also at the same time, right? Yeah. And where our reality, I think, is more exposed than ever before to our decisions. And so it's just how we use that data, right? And the second point that you mentioned about focus, being very focused, is so difficult to do these days. And I had a previous guest on All Out Coach. He has an engineering background as well, by the way. And he talked about some thermodynamics kind of theories. And he made a distinction of being disruptive, but not being disorderly, which
Right.
sometimes startup companies often confuse, right? And they, instead of creating energy, they create entropy, is how he phrased it. And
I love that.
Yeah, and I like that second point that you brought up, and it's it seems to be a key to your success, right, in your career. And just to reference the previous guest, whom I probably should identify, his name is Dan Reardon. Dan Reardon. He's also an entrepreneur, helped various different startups. One follow-up question I want to ask that I was curious about was your success in identifying high potential products in pipeline as you were architecting with the portfolios of various pharma and tech companies as well.
Yeah.
What do you attribute that to your operations and KPIs, or your analysis, or which one of these, let's say, were most helpful in identifying what product a company needs to invest in most or first?
I think they're all important, but the way I think about it is you have to be really transparent about what success looks like. And you got to understand the market super well. And when I look for those success metrics, I want to define them carefully enough, especially when I'm evaluating an individual project, to understand that potential. Because if I don't understand what my customers want, where my market's going, and I don't have data around that, everything looks good. What is it, the old adage? If you don't know where you're going, every road looks good. If you do know where you're going, some of the roads might look good, but look really hard at the quality of that road as well, and what each individual project has the potential to succeed for. I wouldn't want to presuppose, any path. At the same time, I think that the place organizations I've seen fall down more often than not into making a bad decision is, and there's been lots of research done on this, and Kahneman is great on this, but we often think we know,
right,
and look for data that confirms that. We get that confirmation bias going instead of looking at the data and asking ourselves that honest, transparent question: where is this?
Yeah.
And will it meet the needs of what's in the market? And being open to the fact that new data may emerge next week that I didn't know before, that could change the decision.
Yeah.
And that can be really hard to look at with an openness of mind.
Yeah, I see. So, yeah, it seems to me you truly apply both the sportsmanship principles and that scientific thinking, the scientific method in your techniques, in your approach, which I think I share with you wholeheartedly, by the way. And yeah, I really appreciate, and also our passion for teaching is something you and I think have in common, for which I'm very grateful. Again, I want to ask you, Melissa, also about the role of performance metrics, since you've already touched on them. How did those KPIs in particular impact team collaboration or interdepartmental rivalry?
Yeah, KPIs are interesting things. They have often unintended consequences. And I'll use an analogy. And it's my favorite thing about the sport of hockey is that when you gather stats, you get a point for the goal if you make it as an individual, but you also get a point for the assist. And I think that fundamentally shapes how people show up on the ice. And I think the same is true for organizations. That when, unlike baseball, basketball, other sports, when that goal counts, even if you don't do it, you have what the right thing to do is. Working together, collaborating as a team is the most impactful way to play the game. And it's the most impactful way to show up. But having KPIs that don't fly in the face of that and that instead reinforce that matters. So the thing that I often see in terms of unintended consequences is with KPIs. It's that you think your KPIs are setting you up for the behaviors you want to encourage, but you always want to ask, okay, what's the unintended consequence of this? Because there is no perfect way of keeping score, right? There is no perfect way. And so you want to, when I set up, the KPIs to encourage the behaviors I want, then I try and take a step back and say, what are the unintended consequences of these KPIs? Worst case, what would happen if they did everything exactly the way I'm intending it to do? What would happen? And could that be a bad thing? And in most cases, it is. So the way I think about it, and John Van Manen talks a little bit about this, who started out as an ethnographer, and in the days when management science was more scientific, or trying to be, and he would say it's art and science. And I apply that same principle with KPIs and OKRs, is that I want a strong enough culture that says what you do matters, and here's how I'm going to measure that. But half of the way I'm measuring you is on how you do it and how you show up, so that acts as the check for that and balance for the OKRs to make sure it's understood that I expect you to collaborate. I expect you to do these other things. And so that moral compass can offset an OKR being taken too far to the extreme.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's a perfect solution, but that's the only one that I've found that helps offset the fact that it can be hard to set these OKRs perfectly the first time.
Sure. It's funny you say that, and you actually utilize the words that really resonate, and that I've also actually shared with my colleagues and my peers in this new medical productivity index that I've been speaking and writing a lot about for my function in the last few, over the last 4 years, where I value performance and behaviors or engagement as 50% each in this medical
That's right.
productivity index, which is the only formula it's the only formula in which you are able to reward both sportsmanship and competition as well, where you can eliminate people who don't believe in the meaning of that contest or the KPI, yet they believe in the nature of the role, what they're doing, but they don't feel like they're evaluated appropriately. Or sometimes you have, I think, cases where you are told that this is the competition, particularly in my function, which is not a directly revenue generating medical function. We're there to educate and to physicians and share information.
Right.
And that's why metrics for us has been somewhat of a nebulous kind of concept. Yet I believe you needed some kind of estimate of the relationship between activities and outcomes. And so often what happens, I think, is that you're told that that's your goal, that you're told to kind of run a 100-meter dash, but you're not told where the finish line is. And I think that leaves a lot to misinterpretation, which is why a lot of the medical teams in pharma struggle with communicating their value, which I'm trying to solve. And so I was so glad that you to hear that, and from you about the role of behaviors as well as performance. And I want to ask you to define OKRs for those who may not.
Objectives and key results. So
objectives and key results. So they're different from KPIs, or?
So the KPIs are key performance indicators.
Right.
So the objectives and key results, think about them as they're sort of the description that connects the strategy through objectives, key results, and then you measure them with the key performance indicators. So all it is that sort of structured way of having the whole thing focus on the long-term strategic objectives. The one thing I want to add too, when you're talking about the what, and this gets back to some of the research that Amy Edmondson has done around sort of wicked hard problems and high performing teams in things like medical, scientific, and engineering spaces. And what she recognized is that team learning behaviors and individual learning behaviors, those are hard to measure in the short term, but ultimately it's what drives performance in the long term. And so those, how you behave, in some ways, those are a way of measuring for that long term, and providing perspective around that when you don't have specific measures. Because we know building connections inside and outside your own network, having a humble approach to taking on new information, understanding your own limitations. Those are all necessary components of a learning behavior. And I'm going to share one thing here. As I think about it, is that you want to have a culture that is psychologically safe.
Sure.
So that you can start to innovate. You want to have that humility where you work together as a team. But here are the things that you really need to make sure you have in order to set up your ability to learn and grow as a team. You want to make sure you're encouraging and architecting diverse networks for everyone, shared values, engendering flexibility and adaptability, making sure there's solid judgment and decision making, and then organizational learning. These are all capabilities that you need in order to deliver extraordinary performance. But as you can see, these are things that are really tough to measure in a quantifiable way. And the only thing you can often measure in an organization is the results that happen because of this in your KPIs.
And so how do you help visualize those metrics in those or those scenarios where they are so abstract? Do you feel like they need to be quantified in some form of index, or similar to, let's say, frequent flyer miles, that kind of that are an imperfect way to describe your loyalty to an airline, yet they kind of they inspire you to fly more often, right? And earn that free flight.
They do. And, you know, it's one of those things that I think it's more art than science in this case, because each person, to try and maximize all of them at the same time and understand in specific ways exactly how, like, how good or bad all of those things are, it can be really tough. And so the way I have tended to lean into it, I mean, would I love for there to be a measure and a formula? Yes. As an engineer, if we could do everything by formula, including every relationship I have, my kids, my husband, my mom, that would be awesome. But I think that's not realistic. And so the way I've thought about it is I try really hard to have quarterly at least discussions with each of my team members about how they're doing on those dimensions. What are we doing? And then with my team, what are we doing around these dimensions? What do we need to lean more into? What's working? What's not? How is that playing out in our results? And I try and make sure we have those conversations and think about that in terms of the growth I want them to be able to seize. And it's a little more qualitative than quantitative. But if you come up with a quantitative measure, I am all in and I will roll it out.
Okay, well, I'll have to share this index with you, absolutely, because one of the messages that I've been sharing with our medical affairs leaders in pharma is that if we're able to somehow quantify pain through visual analog scores and validate them and use them in clinical trials, or if we're able to somehow express music through notes, through sheet music, in order to recreate those successes and those masterpieces in a predictable manner, then probably I believe that we in medical need to come up with some way that combines both leading and lagging measures. But your point about, I think your approach, your individual approach there is to focus on the leading measures as you check in with your teams in order to be able to maximize the efforts, I think, right? And the intent is what I take away from your approach, right? Because that's ultimately what's going to drive those results later.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's really, and I love your example of the sheet music. When we figured out how to get music down at the same time, that sheet music, I've had fabulous performances of the same piece of music, and that there's an element of art to it that it can be difficult to quantify. And so I tend to embrace the limitations of each approach and try and offset it with something else, because how I feel hearing that piece of music, fundamentally different in different ways of performing it. And so things that might work for one individual in one team might not work for another. They might not be as moving, as effective. There's that humanity that it both makes us extraordinary as individuals and as teams and as organizations, and makes us complex and hard to lead.
Well, we talked about a lot of different, I think, approaches and elements of teams, of not just building and belonging to teams, as was the focus in one of my previous episodes, but in exploring how they collaborate and why we need to measure and inspire, right, collaboration, competition. I want to get to the outcomes a little bit, and what I've found is that some of the leading business management cases of some of the most successful companies, even ones that don't have any hierarchy, like in W.L. Gore and Associates, for example, with Bill Gore, or Paul Polman, who came into Unilever, or James Rhee, who came into Ashley Stewart. They transformed their organizations while changing the norms of communication, but also they featured metrics. Bill Gore had only a CEO and no hierarchy, and every single employee was asked to rank 20 or 30 of their colleagues, and they were matched with a new hire that they were incentivized to ensure their success as not just a mentor but as a sponsor, for example, right? And that company hasn't shown an annual loss in over 6 decades, for example, right? When you lead with the values, with the initial talent strategy that you've led, what have been some of the outcomes? Directly.
Most outcomes, and this is where you got to match it to the culture, right? I love your examples because the business that they're in and the culture they're able to create are intertwined. And so it depends on the business. So where I've seen great outcomes, it's when you focus on what absolutely matters most. And the examples you just provided really do. We don't need the hierarchy because of how we're doing things and what business we're in. In the cases that I've been in, again, very few goals, very high standards that focus on excellence. And the fact that we expect at the organizational level, at the team level, and at the individual level, you to show up and do your very best. The other thing that I've been able to do that has made a performance change is bringing in data around those few things that matter most of all, and making sure we take action that people can observe, see, and replicate. So performance, at one company, we basically took them from almost going out of business to setting the standard for profitability in the whole industry within the space of about 3 years. And that's really tough to do. But if you're laser focused on that single problem, it becomes very easy, because you can say, okay, here's the thing that's not working. Let's figure out what the drivers of that are and begin to implement some changes that will move that forward. You keep score, you look at that, and then you shift what you're focused on. One organization, we were turning around the financial organization, that we didn't have data. We had a lot of challenges. So we put together this is what we're doing by calendar in each of the sprints. Every sprint this year, we worked together on doing that. And what we found is the outcomes really mattered because they were owned by everyone, and everyone could understand them. There was transparency, get behind them. But transparency, consistency, focus, and data. If you get those 4 things, and then you balance it with the sort of what matters, but also how you show up also matters, it's hard to not get better.
Yeah. Well, thinking about 2 different extremes of successes and failures, what tends to happen in terms of outcomes to team performance and quality and culture when teams fail or when they're extremely successful?
Extreme failure and extreme success are the 2 places where it's really hardest to learn. I got to be honest, because in extreme failure, you're crushed, right? It feels like there's nothing good you can take away. Right. And usually, there's firings, and everybody has this natural human tendency to want to distance themselves from that. The same is true for successes. Success, or as, a rising tide, hides all kinds of sins. As Charlie Munger would say, when the tide goes out, you find out who's swimming naked. But while the tide's in, you don't know that. And so it can mask some things. The learning zone for me that I have found for most teams is really in between those two things. And it's only with great discipline that at extreme success or failure that you can take those best lessons away and understand what works, what doesn't, what was an anomaly and what wasn't.
Yeah, we had a next generation product at that startup company, as I think I've told you this before, at a time when I took your course, I registered for your course, and we were failing despite having the best next generation product. But as a company, we were failing. Yet I had identified that gap for learning. And that's probably why, based on your explanation and also my own feelings and emotions, why I found your course just so transformational for me. I mean, you had a variety of formats with which people learned, and you put us in different teams, also diverse teams with a lot of hands-on exercises, simulation exercises to conclude the final capstone project. And also you shared with us a lot of references, a wealth of reference, a library of references, which I have to this day, by the way, Melissa. So I think that's a great note to bring our conversation to the end and to hopefully spark more questions from those who listen, to contact you as well, connect with you, Melissa. I would like to ask you, what is one final lesson that you'd like to share with those who are going to listen to All Out Coach, where my motto is stretch yourself, lift others?
For me, the thing that I would say, it's two things. As a recovering engineer, I will say that, everything is both art and science. We cannot forget that organizations are systems, but they're systems of people. So we need both the science and the quantifiable things, but we also need the complexity and the ability to navigate that, because they're systems of people. And if we're going to make that be a strength, we need to figure out how to handle both simultaneously and hold that dichotomy in as leaders. The second thing I would say is, for me, I love Colin's work around level 5 leaders, and believe that he really hit on something extraordinary when he unpacked this notion of humility and excellence, and the fact that we have to simultaneously pursue both. That we have to, without the humility, we don't learn, we don't understand our circle of competence well enough to perform well. And without the excellence, we don't have that drive to continue to push things forward. And so those are my sort of two dichotomies that I try and navigate most of my leadership with.
Yeah, humility and excellence. Thank you very much, Melissa, for your time, for a lot of your valuable lessons. I know I'll be sharing some of my sports analogies with batting average and slugging, and integrating a lot of business management principles into medical, into pharma as well. So I know our conversation will continue, and I hope yours will do as well. Those who listen, please connect with Melissa. She's an inspirational leader who's played a tremendous role in my life and my career, whom I'm grateful to. So thank you very much, Melissa, for being a guest on All Out Coach.